Japanese POWs couldn't believe America let them watch movies in camps. A Japanese sergeant arrives expecting torture and death, and instead finds clean bunk beds, hot meals, a dentist, and a projector in the mess hall. Guards hand out popcorn. They watch Hollywood stories about ordinary men who argue with their leaders, play baseball on Saturdays, and learn English in classrooms set up behind barbed wire. At first it feels like a trap. Then the prisoners start to gain weight, learn trades, and ask impossible questions about the world they were taught to hate. Mercy becomes confusing. Mercy becomes dangerous. Mercy begins to break the story they were raised to believe. Is this kindness? Or a weapon that can defeat an empire from the inside? Sergeant Shinji Yamamoto knew he was going to die. The train had stopped. Through the wooden slats of the cattle car, he could see pine trees and a sign that read, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The other 32 Japanese prisoners sat in rigid silence, each man preparing his spirit for what came next. They had all heard the stories. American devils skinned prisoners alive. They fed captives to dogs. They performed medical experiments that made death a mercy. Yamamoto had been captured in the Aleutian Islands in August 1943. For 3 weeks afterward, he had tried to starve himself to death, the only honorable response to the eternal shame of surrender. But the American medics had force-fed him through a tube. Even that violation had seemed like preliminary torture, the opening move in a longer game of suffering. The train car door slid open. Sunlight flooded in. An American guard, no older than 20, gestured them out. "Let's go, fellas. Move it along." Yamamoto's legs barely held him as he stepped onto the platform. He looked for the execution posts, the torture chambers, the pits where they would burn the bodies. Instead, he saw neat rows of wooden barracks, a flagpole, a baseball diamond. An officer approached, Captain Morrison, according to his name tag. He spoke through an interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier whose very existence confused Yamamoto. How could a man of Japanese blood wear an American uniform without shame? "You will be processed," the interpreter said. "You will be examined by medical staff. You will be issued clean uniforms and assigned barracks. You will receive 3 meals per day. Any questions?" Yamamoto's mind reeled. This was the trap. It had to be. The kindness was the torture. They would build hope just to destroy it more completely. The medical examination came first. Yamamoto stripped, certain the American doctors would begin the experiments he'd been warned about. Instead, they checked his teeth, listened to his heart, treated the infected wound on his shoulder with antiseptic that stung but didn't burn. A nurse, an actual woman, bandaged his arm with the same care she might show a child. "You're underweight," the doctor said through the interpreter. "We'll get some meat on those bones." Then came the uniform, not rags, not prison stripes, but a clean shirt and trousers, slightly worn but whole, with PW stenciled on the back. The guard who issued them was chewing gum and looked bored. The barracks were simple but weatherproof. Each man received a bunk with a mattress, an actual mattress, not straw, and 2 wool blankets. The latrine had running water. The guard posted at the door carried a rifle, but seemed more interested in a magazine he was reading. Finally, mess call. The smell hit Yamamoto 50 yards from the dining hall. Baked bread, cooked meat, coffee. His stomach, empty except for the water he'd been able to keep down, twisted painfully. This was it. This was where the torture began. They would starve them while food sat within reach. They would beat anyone who tried to eat. He shuffled through the line with the others, each man's face a mask of stoic preparation. A cook, a Negro soldier, which itself was strange, laded stew onto Yamamoto's metal tray, thick chunks of beef, potatoes, carrots, a piece of bread, still warm, coffee with real sugar. "Eat up," the cook said, not unkindly. Yamamoto sat at the long wooden table. He stared at the food. Around him, the other prisoners did the same. No one moved. This was a test. They would eat, and then the Americans would cut open their stomachs to retrieve the food, laughing at their weakness. An older prisoner, a corporal named Sato, picked up his spoon. His hand shook. He lifted a piece of beef to his mouth, chewed, swallowed. Nothing happened. Sato took another bite, then another. The dam broke. 33 men began eating with the desperate intensity of prisoners who expected the meal to be their last. Yamamoto had not tasted beef in 3 years. In Japan, his village had sent every grain of rice, every scrap of protein to the military. His own parents had been eating bark and grass. And here, in the enemy's prisoner camp, he was eating stew so rich it made him dizzy. The American guard watching them didn't laugh, didn't sneer. He just stood there, occasionally glancing at his watch like he had somewhere else to be. That first week unfolded like a fever dream. Yamamoto waited for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to end and the real torture to begin. Instead, each day brought fresh impossibilities. They were given soap, real soap, not the gritty substitute he'd used in the Imperial Army. They could shower with hot water. The guards didn't watch them, didn't force them into humiliating positions, didn't beat anyone who was too slow. On the third day, they were issued work assignments. Yamamoto expected labor in mines or factories, the brutal toil of slaves. Instead, he was assigned to help maintain the camp garden. The work was light. The guards supervising them chatted among themselves about something called baseball standings. On the 5th day, a guard taught him the English word for shovel, not through beatings, but through simple repetition and hand gestures. Shovel, the guard said, pointing at the tool. Can you say that? Shovel. Shovel, Yamamoto repeated, the syllables foreign in his mouth. The guard grinned. Yeah, that's it. You're getting it. Why would the enemy want him to learn their language? What possible purpose could it serve except to make the torture more precise, more personal? On Saturday night, the impossible became incomprehensible. Guards herded all the prisoners toward the mess hall. Yamamoto's heart hammered. This was it. This was where they would be killed en masse, all together, after a week of false hope that made their spirits soft. Inside, the tables had been pushed to the walls. Wooden chairs faced a white screen at the far end. A strange machine sat on a table in the back, a film projector, though Yamamoto didn't know the English word. An officer addressed them through the interpreter. Tonight's entertainment is a motion picture called Stagecoach. It's a Western. It's about cowboys and Indians. You'll like it. Entertainment. Motion pictures. The words made no sense together. The lights went dark. The projector whirred to life. And suddenly, impossibly, the screen showed moving images of men on horses, a stagecoach racing through a desert that looked nothing like Japan or Wisconsin. Gunfights and drama, and a story that pulled Yamamoto in despite himself. He sat in a room full of enemy prisoners, eating popcorn that guards had passed around in paper bags, watching an American entertainment as if he were a civilian in a cinema in Tokyo, not a disgraced captive who should be dead. When the lights came up 2 hours later, Yamamoto sat in stunned silence. Around him, other prisoners murmured in confusion. One man was crying, though whether from emotion over the story or the sheer cognitive dissonance of the situation, Yamamoto couldn't tell. That night, unable to sleep, he retrieved the small notebook he'd hidden in his mattress. The Americans hadn't found it during their searches, or perhaps they had and simply didn't care. He had been recording observations, certain that if he somehow survived, the Imperial Army would want intelligence on American torture methods. Instead, by the light filtering through the barracks window, he wrote something that would have gotten him executed back home. I do not understand. They give us 3 meals every day. The guards do not beat us. Yesterday, they showed us a moving picture about cowboys. The food is better than what I ate as a soldier in the Emperor's army. The barracks are warmer than my family's home. I believe I am dead and this is some strange afterlife. Or perhaps everything we were told about the Americans was a lie. I do not know which possibility frightens me more." He paused, pen hovering over paper, then added a final line. "If this is captivity, what have we been fighting for?" Outside, an American guard made his rounds, boots crunching on gravel. Somewhere in the distance, music played from a radio, big band jazz, brassy and alive. In the guard tower, two soldiers shared a cigarette and talked about girls back home. And in a barracks filled with enemy prisoners, Sergeant Shinji Yamamoto faced a more devastating weapon than any bomb: the creeping, terrible suspicion that his entire understanding of the war, the enemy, and the world might be catastrophically wrong. The Americans weren't devils. That was the truly unforgivable thing. They were just people, impossibly wealthy people, showing the kind of casual mercy that only the overwhelmingly powerful can afford. And mercy, Yamamoto was beginning to understand, might be the most dangerous weapon of all. The supply truck rumbled through the gates of Camp Livingston, Louisiana, at 0600 hours. Its cargo wasn't bullets or grenades. The bed sagged under crates of fresh cabbage, sacks of Idaho potatoes, and sides of beef wrapped in canvas. Destination: the prisoner of war kitchen. Master Sergeant Frank O'Brien, Quartermaster Corps, checked his manifest with the same attention to detail he'd once given to munitions shipments in North Africa. 80 pounds of pork shoulder, 200 pounds of rice, 40 dozen eggs, he muttered, ticking off items. Behind him, Japanese POWs unloaded the truck under the watchful eye of a single guard eating a candy bar. The absurdity wasn't lost on O'Brien. His brother was somewhere in the Pacific surviving on K-rations and whatever the Navy could deliver through submarine-infested waters. Meanwhile, O'Brien was ensuring enemy soldiers got 3 square meals a day. "Sarge, we got a problem," Private Jackson called from the warehouse. "We're over capacity on beef again. Where you want the overflow?" O'Brien sighed. "Same place as last week, the German compound at Camp Polk. They requested extra for their Sunday cookout. A cookout. For prisoners. In the middle of a world war. This was the American war machine, operating on a scale that would have collapsed any other nation's economy. By 1944, the United States was feeding 2.4 million meals to prisoners of war every single day. Not survival rations, not punishment gruel. Actual meals that met or exceeded Geneva Convention standards, prepared in kitchens that would have impressed a hotel chain. The math was staggering. Across 511 POW camps, from California to Maine, the Quartermaster Corps was executing the largest feeding operation in human history, outside of feeding the Allied armies themselves. Every day, American trucks delivered fresh produce, dairy, meat, and grain to men who had tried to kill Americans weeks or months earlier. Captain Robert Morrison, the supply officer at Camp Livingston, explained the logic in a letter to his wife that survived in National Archives records. "The Krauts and the Japs keep asking why we feed them so well. I tell them it's because we can. Because while they were building tanks, we were building everything. We didn't have to choose." The numbers proved his point. In 1943 alone, American farms produced enough food to feed the entire U.S. population, supply 60% of Allied military provisions, send massive shipments to Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, and still have surplus to fatten enemy prisoners. At Camp Livingston, the daily menu for Japanese POWs included breakfast of oatmeal, scrambled eggs, toast with butter, and coffee. Lunch brought beef stew, bread, vegetables, and fruit. Dinner featured pork chops, mashed potatoes, green beans, and pie. The cooks, American soldiers who'd trained at actual culinary schools before the war, followed recipes designed by military dietitians. Private First Class Kazuo Tanaka, a Japanese prisoner who'd survived on half rations before his capture at Saipan, gained 17 pounds in his first month at Camp Livingston. He wrote in a diary later seized during a routine inspection, "I eat more in 1 week than my family ate in a month. The guards watch us eat. They do not seem to understand this is strange." It was strange. While American GIs in Europe were trading cigarettes for chocolate bars to supplement their field rations, and Marines in the Pacific were eating canned Spam heated over makeshift fires, POWs in Louisiana were complaining the coffee wasn't hot enough. The industrial logistics behind this abundance would have overwhelmed any other nation. Consider what America was simultaneously managing in 1944. Building one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at Willow Run, launching a new Liberty ship every day and a half, producing enough ammunition to fire 23 billion rounds, manufacturing 96,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and feeding 425,000 enemy prisoners 3 meals a day. Major General Allen W. Gullion, Provost Marshal General, laid it out in a memo that made the rounds at the War Department. The United States will comply fully with the Geneva Convention not because our enemy does, but because we possess the industrial capacity to do so without compromising military effectiveness. Translation: we're so wealthy, so productive, so overwhelmingly superior that being humane costs us nothing. The Japanese prisoners at Camp Livingston struggled to process this reality. Sergeant Shinji Yamamoto, who'd been transferred from Camp McCoy, watched American guards drive personal automobiles to shift changes. The guards owned cars. Individual enlisted men possessed personal vehicles worth more than most Japanese families earned in years. In the camp canteen, prisoners could purchase Coca-Cola, chocolate bars, cigarettes, and toiletries with scrip they earned from voluntary work details. The concept of a prisoner commissary stocked like a corner store violated everything they understood about captivity. In our camps, American prisoners fought over scraps. Corporal Kenji Sato told Yamamoto one evening, "Here we complain when the ice cream runs out." The ice cream was real. Camp Livingston had installed a soft-serve machine in the canteen in 1944. On summer evenings, Japanese POWs lined up for vanilla cones while guards stood by reading comic books. Master Sergeant O'Brien witnessed the psychological impact firsthand. You'd see these prisoners arrive, all defiance and Bushido code. Then they'd hit the mess hall for a week. Suddenly they're asking questions. If America has so much, why did you need to attack us? They couldn't grasp we never attacked them. They started it. We just finished it with such overwhelming force they couldn't believe it was possible. The scale became even more mind-blowing when compared to enemy logistics. The entire Japanese military couldn't feed its own soldiers adequately. Rice rations had been cut repeatedly since 1942. Frontline troops were starving. Yet here, in the heart of enemy territory, captured Japanese soldiers were eating better than they had in their own barracks. A supply report from Camp Livingston, dated March 1944, listed weekly provisions for 3,000 Japanese prisoners. 2,100 pounds of beef, 900 pounds of pork, 1,800 dozen eggs, 750 gallons of milk, 500 pounds of butter, 1,200 loaves of bread, and 300 pounds of coffee. That same month, the Japanese military reduced frontline rations to 600 grams of rice per day per soldier, a starvation diet that assumed soldiers would forage or loot for additional food. The contrast wasn't accidental. It was the result of two completely different philosophies of war colliding with industrial reality. Japan had mobilized its entire economy for war and still couldn't feed its armies adequately. America had mobilized a fraction of its capacity and was feeding everyone, including the enemy. By 1944, America was producing 60% of all Allied military equipment: tanks, planes, ships, trucks, guns, ammunition. The United States outproduced Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. This industrial supremacy meant that feeding POWs generously wasn't a strategic sacrifice. It was a rounding error. The Quartermaster Corps budget for POW food in 1944 was $87 million, enormous by normal standards. But that same year, the United States spent $94 billion on war production overall. POW feeding costs represented 0.09% of the war budget. America could afford to be humane, because America could afford everything. Captain Morrison understood the psychological warfare value. Every pound of weight these prisoners gain is a pound of doubt about their emperor's promises. Every full belly is evidence their officers lied. We're not just feeding them, we're destroying their ideology, 3 meals at a time. The evidence mounted daily. At Camp Livingston, prisoners who'd served in China told stories of Japanese soldiers dying from malnutrition while occupying farmland. The cognitive dissonance was devastating. Their empire couldn't feed its conquering armies, but the enemy fed its prisoners restaurant-quality meals. Sergeant Yamamoto captured the psychological impact in his hidden notebook. Today I ate beef better than my father ever tasted. I worked 2 hours in the garden by choice, for scrip to buy chocolate. My boots are new, my uniform is clean. The guard who gave me these things cannot be evil. If he is not evil, what does that make us? The transformation happened across all 511 camps. German POWs noticed it too. At facilities holding both German and Japanese prisoners, the Germans marveled that America extended identical treatment to both groups despite Pearl Harbor, despite the Bataan Death March, despite everything. A German officer at Camp Trinidad, Colorado, wrote in a letter intercepted by censors, "The Americans do not discriminate in their mercy. Japanese prisoners who committed atrocities received the same beef stew as German prisoners who fought with honor. This is either supreme foolishness or a demonstration of power we failed to recognize. I suspect the latter. It was power. The power of a nation so secure in its superiority, so abundant in resources, so confident in its values that generosity became a weapon authoritarian empires couldn't counter." The final numbers told the story. By war's end, the United States had processed nearly 500,000 POWs through its camp system. The mortality rate for prisoners in American custody was less than 1%, mostly from diseases contracted before capture. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American POWs in Japanese camps were dying at a rate of 40%. Not from disease, from deliberate starvation, torture, and execution. 2 philosophies of war. One produced abundant life even in captivity. The other produced death even in victory. And the Japanese prisoners at Camp Livingston, growing healthier and heavier with each passing week, were learning which philosophy possessed the real power. The mess hall at Camp Clarinda, Iowa had been transformed. Rows of folding chairs faced a white bedsheet stretched across the far wall. A Bell and Howell projector sat on a wooden crate in the back, its reels loaded with something that would shatter minds more effectively than any bomb. Saturday, March 18, 1944. Movie night. Sergeant Shinji Yamamoto filed in with 200 other Japanese prisoners, his mind still struggling with the cognitive dissonance of his captivity. 3 months in American custody, and nothing made sense. The guards who called him Sarge instead of beating him, the mess hall that served pork chops while Tokyo civilians ate tree bark, and now this, entertainment provided by the enemy. The lights went down, the projector whirred to life. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington began to flicker across that improvised screen. For the next 2 hours, Japanese prisoners raised to worship the emperor as a living god watched an ordinary American man stand in his own government's Senate and call them liars. Out loud. On film. Distributed nationwide. The room sat in stunned silence. Corporal Kenji Sato leaned toward Yamamoto in the darkness. "This is propaganda," he whispered. "It must be. No government allows such criticism." But Yamamoto wasn't so sure anymore. He'd seen too much. The abundance, the casual mercy, the guards who argued politics with each other right in front of prisoners, openly disagreeing about their own president's policies. When the film ended and lights came up, Nobody moved. Captain Robert Morrison, the camp's intelligence officer, watched from the back of the room. He'd seen this reaction before, at Camp McCoy, at Camp Livingston, at every facility where the War Department's radical experiment in psychological warfare played out on bedsheet screens. "Popcorn works better than bullets," Morrison would later write in his classified report to Washington. "We're not changing minds through force. We're doing it with Frank Capra films and Saturday matinees." The strategy came from the top. Major General Allen W. Gullion had authorized film screenings at POW camps in 1943, against the protests of officers who considered it soft. But Gullion understood something profound. You don't defeat an ideology by suppressing it. You defeat it by exposing it to something better. The film program started small, newsreels and educational shorts. By 1944, prisoners were watching Hollywood's finest: westerns, musicals, war films that showed the massive scale of American production. And yes, political dramas that depicted ordinary citizens challenging their government. Private First Class Frank Fujita, the Japanese-American interpreter at Camp Livingston, witnessed the transformation firsthand. "After their first movie night, I had prisoners cornering me with questions," he recalled in his memoirs. Was it true Americans could criticize Roosevelt? Was it true families owned automobiles? Was it true women could vote? The answer to all of it: yes. At Camp Clarinda that Saturday night, Yamamoto watched his fellow prisoners file out of the mess hall in silence. Some looked angry, others confused. A few wore expressions he'd never seen on Japanese military faces. Doubt. In the barracks that night, heated arguments erupted in whispered Japanese. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, one of the hardliners who still believed in ultimate victory, stood on his bunk and addressed the room. "The film is lies," he declared, "American propaganda to break our spirit." "Then explain the food," someone challenged from the darkness. "Explain the medical care. Explain why the guards don't beat us. Fattening us for some purpose we cannot see," Nakamura insisted. But his voice carried less certainty than it had 3 months ago. Yamamoto said nothing. He pulled out his hidden notebook, the one that started as intelligence gathering and became something else entirely. His latest entry told the truth he couldn't speak aloud. If the film is propaganda, it is the strangest kind. It shows their government as flawed, their leaders as human, their system as imperfect. Our propaganda showed us as divine and invincible. We were taught America was weak and decadent. But decadent nations do not feed their enemies 3 meals daily. Weak nations do not build baseball fields for prisoners. And divine emperors do not allow citizens to question them in public forums. The psychological impact was deliberate. Captain Harold Hoskins, psychological warfare specialist attached to the Provost Marshal General's office, had spent 2 years studying POW reactions to American media exposure. His findings were classified, but explosive. "Subject matter of films matters less than the act itself," Hoskins wrote in his July 1944 report. "Enemy prisoners cannot reconcile entertainment privileges with their indoctrination about American brutality. Cognitive dissonance creates openings for ideological conversion that no interrogation technique can achieve." Hoskins documented specific responses. After screenings of Meet Me in St. Louis, Japanese POWs obsessed over the casual displays of wealth, the large homes, abundant food, consumer goods treated as ordinary. After Westerns, they marveled at the individualism, the lack of rigid hierarchy, the celebration of personal freedom over collective duty. One prisoner, identified only as Subject 247 in Hoskins's files, provided the money quote, "If what they show in the pictures is true, then our fight is not just hopeless, it is foolish. We are attempting to conquer a people who have already achieved what our emperor promises for Japan's future." Holy shit! An enemy soldier admitting ideological defeat because of movies. The numbers backed it up. By March 1945, Over 60% of Japanese POWs in American camps had volunteered for work details, educational programs, or recreational activities. Participation rates that would have been unthinkable in 1942. The conversion wasn't universal, but it was measurable. Compare that to American POWs in Japanese camps, where participation in any activity meant collaboration, where kindness was a trick, where mercy didn't exist. German prisoners noticed the same pattern. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, a captured Luftwaffe officer named Klaus Hermann wrote in his diary, "The Americans show Japanese prisoners the same films they show us, the same food, the same recreational privileges. This despite Pearl Harbor, despite the Pacific War's brutality. Either they are fools or they possess a form of strength Germany never understood." It was strength. The strength of a nation so confident in its values that it could afford to display them even to sworn enemies. The film program operated on a scale that would seem impossible today. The War Department coordinated screenings at over 400 camps, distributing 16mm prints through a logistics network that rivaled combat supply chains. Projectors, film reels, replacement bulbs, trained operators, all provided while simultaneously managing the largest amphibious invasion in history. In 1 week in June 1944, American forces landed at Normandy, captured Saipan in the Pacific, and screened Casablanca for 85,000 POWs across 200 camps. The same organizational capacity, the same attention to detail. Back at Camp Clarinda, Yamamoto lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling. Corporal Sato in the next bed finally spoke the question hanging in the darkness. "If they can make films criticizing their own government," Sato whispered, "what else did our officers lie about?" Yamamoto had no answer, but he knew the question itself was dangerous, more dangerous than any American weapon. The next morning, a work detail of prisoners helped unload a new shipment of film reels from a War Department truck. Yamamoto glimpsed the titles written on the canisters. The Grapes of Wrath, It Happened One Night, Yankee Doodle Dandy, More Psychological Bombs Waiting to Detonate. A guard, Corporal James Peterson from Minnesota, noticed Yamamoto's interest. "You like the movies, Sarge?" The casual question, the casual nickname, the casual humanity. It was all part of the same weapon system. "Yes," Yamamoto heard himself say in broken English. "Movies. Good." Peterson grinned. "Next week we're showing a Western, John Wayne. You'll love it." In that moment, Yamamoto understood the terrible truth Captain Hoskins had documented, but never fully stated. America wasn't defeating Japan through superior firepower alone. They were defeating Japan by being so overwhelmingly, casually, impossibly better at being human, that resistance became absurd. You can't fight movies with Bushido. You can't counter generosity with honor codes written in blood. You can't defeat 3 meals a day and Saturday night entertainment with promises of glorious death. The Americans had discovered the ultimate weapon, showing enemy soldiers what their own government could never provide. And it was working. The afternoon sun beat down on the makeshift baseball diamond at Camp Hearn, Texas, turning the infield dirt into powder. Sergeant Shinji Yamamoto crouched at second base, his PW uniform soaked with sweat, watching Private First Class Takeshi Ito wind up for a pitch. 6 months ago, Yamamoto had expected to die in honorable combat. Now he was arguing with an American corporal about whether a runner was safe at second. "Out!" Corporal James Peterson called, his thumb jerking skyward. "No!" Yamamoto shouted before he could stop himself, pointing at the base. The runner's foot had clearly touched before the tag. "Safe! Safe!" Peterson grinned and changed his call. "You're right, Sarge. Safe it is." Yamamoto blinked. An American guard had just admitted he was wrong. To a Japanese prisoner. Over a game. This violated everything the Emperor's military had taught him. Guards didn't concede points to prisoners. Captors didn't play games with the captured. Yet here stood Peterson, refereeing their baseball league like it mattered who won. The game resumed. Yamamoto caught a line drive and threw a runner out at first. His team cheered, not the mechanical chorus of imperial soldiers performing duty, but genuine celebration over something completely pointless in the grand scheme of war. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, the hardliner who still refused to eat with Americans, stood watching from the fence line. His face held the expression Yamamoto had started seeing more often in the camp, confusion giving way to something that looked like defeat. "Come play," Yamamoto called to him in Japanese. "It passes the time." "We should be planning resistance," Nakamura replied. "Preparing for liberation by the Emperor's forces." But his voice carried no conviction. They both knew the truth now. The camp newspaper, printed by POWs, approved by Americans, reported Allied victories across the Pacific. Saipan fallen, the Philippines being liberated, B-29s bombing Tokyo itself. The game ended 7-5. Yamamoto's team lost, but Corporal Sato was already organizing next week's rematch. As they walked back toward the barracks, Peterson fell into step beside Yamamoto. "You played ball before the war?" "No," Yamamoto admitted. "In Japan, we had no time for games. Always training, always preparing." Peterson shook his head. "That's no way to live, Sarge." The simple statement hit harder than any propaganda film. The Americans fought the most powerful war in human history, produced more equipment than the entire Axis combined, and still found time for baseball. Still believed men should play games, watch movies, have lives beyond military service. Back in the barracks, Yamamoto found a notice posted in Japanese and English. "Baseball tournament. All camp teams, Sunday, June 18th, 1400 hours. First prize, ice cream social." Corporal Sato read it over his shoulder. "Ice cream for playing a game," he muttered. "The guards who torture us with kindness." That night, Yamamoto added to his hidden notebook. "Today I argued with a guard over a rule in their baseball game. He changed his decision because I was correct. I do not understand a nation that arms its prisoners with baseball bats and teaches them to argue. This is either profound foolishness or a kind of power our empire never possessed." 3 weeks later, the tournament arrived. Every POW camp in Texas had sent teams. German prisoners from Camp Huntsville played Japanese teams from Camp Kennedy. Italian POWs served as groundskeepers, maintaining the field with professional precision. Colonel William Howard, Camp Hearn's commandant, stood behind home plate in his dress uniform. He tossed the first pitch, not to an American guard, but to Sergeant Yamamoto, who had become captain of his barracks team. "Play ball," Howard called. The stadium, built by POW labor, designed to Army specifications, held over 500 spectators. Half were prisoners, half were American guards and local civilians who'd come to watch. They sat in the same bleachers, drank from the same water fountains, cheered for. Plays that showed skill, regardless of who made them. Yamamoto's team faced a German squad from Camp Huntsville. The Germans had been at this longer, playing organized ball since 1943. Their pitcher, a former semi-professional from Munich, threw curves that baffled the Japanese batters. But in the 7th inning, with the score tied 3-3, something impossible happened. Private Ito connected with a fastball and sent it soaring over the left field fence. As he rounded the bases, American guards cheered alongside Japanese prisoners. German POWs applauded the athletic achievement. Colonel Howard whistled through his fingers like a civilian at a regular game. Yamamoto understood then what he'd been too indoctrinated to see before. This wasn't just a baseball game. This was proof that America fought the war differently than any nation in history. They weren't trying to break their prisoners' spirits. They were trying to rebuild them as something else entirely. Men who understood there was more to life than dying for an emperor. The official War Department inventory from June 1944 told the story in numbers that seemed impossible. While coordinating the D-Day invasion, the largest amphibious assault in human history, The U.S. military simultaneously requisitioned baseball equipment for POW camps. 156 dozen baseballs, 520 gloves, 145 bats, 89 catcher's masks, 234 bases. The same month, American forces stormed Normandy Beach under machine gun fire. Procurement officers in Washington were filling out forms to ship Louisville sluggers to Japanese prisoners in Texas. That was American industrial supremacy. That was the power of a nation so absurdly productive it could wage total war on two fronts and still find time, resources, and manpower to teach its enemies how to slide into second base. Yamamoto's team lost the championship 6-4, but as Colonel Howard presented the German team with their ice cream social vouchers, then immediately announced that all participating teams would get ice cream anyway because everyone played hard, Yamamoto felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The emperor had promised that Japanese spirit would overcome American material advantage. That dedication to Bushido would triumph over the soft, decadent democracy. But what if American softness was actually a different kind of strength? What if treating enemies like human beings, giving them baseball and ice cream and second chances, was the most devastating weapon of all? That evening, 73 Japanese POWs lined up for ice cream, vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry, served by American mess staff who smiled and asked their preferences like they were customers instead of captives. Lieutenant Nakamura took vanilla. He ate it slowly, his face a mask of internal struggle. When he finished, he turned to Yamamoto. "The Emperor told us Americans were demons," he said quietly. "But demons do not serve ice cream to their enemies. Demons do not build baseball." Fields for prisoners. Either our entire understanding of the world is wrong, or he didn't finish. He didn't have to. In his notebook that night, Yamamoto wrote, "We have a saying in Japan, the nail that stands up gets hammered down. But Americans celebrate the man who hits the baseball over the fence. They reward individual achievement, even in their prisoners. Our empire taught us to die as one. America teaches men to live as themselves. I begin to understand why they will win this war." The interpreter's notice appeared on the Camp McCoy bulletin board on a Tuesday morning in November 1944. Sergeant Shinji Yamamoto read it twice, certain he'd misunderstood the English words. Educational classes begin Monday. English language instruction, automotive mechanics, American history, voluntary enrollment. Voluntary. That word alone violated everything Yamamoto understood about military captivity. 3 barracks down, Sergeant Matsuo Abe stood before the same notice, his calloused farmer's hands trembling slightly. Back in Hokkaido, his formal education had ended at age 12, when his father needed another pair of hands in the rice fields. Now, at 32, America was offering him something the emperor never had: a classroom. "It's a trick," Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura muttered beside him. But even Nakamura's voice carried less conviction these days. 6 months of American captivity had eroded his certainty, like rain on limestone. By Monday, 43 Japanese POWs sat in the converted recreation hall at Camp McCoy. Captain Robert Morrison watched from the back as Private First Class George Tanaka, a Nisei soldier from California, wrote the alphabet on a chalkboard with methodical precision. A. Apple. B. Baseball. C. Car. Matsuo Abe gripped his pencil like a farm tool, forming each letter with the fierce concentration of a man who sensed opportunity. The graphite scratched across paper provided by the U.S. Army Education Program, the same program simultaneously running literacy classes for American GIs across Europe. Holy shit. America was educating both its own soldiers and enemy prisoners at the same time. This wasn't happening in isolated camps. By late 1944, the Provost Marshal General's office had authorized educational programs in over 400 POW facilities. German officers studied engineering at Camp Como, Mississippi. Italian prisoners learned English literature at Camp Hereford, Texas. Japanese sailors practiced automotive repair at Camp Livingston, Louisiana. The scope was staggering. The War Department allocated $3.2 million for POW education in 1944 alone, roughly equivalent to $52 million today. They shipped 127,000 textbooks, 15,000 sets of tools for vocational training, and 2,400 chalkboards behind barbed wire. While doing this, America was also coordinating the largest amphibious invasion in Pacific history at Leyte Gulf. At Camp Angel Island, California, Commander Kazuo Sakamaki, Pearl Harbor's first prisoner, sat in an advanced English class, parsing sentences from a dog-eared copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd once piloted a midget submarine in a surprise attack meant to cripple America's Pacific Fleet. Now he was learning English grammar from Mark Twain, courtesy of his captor's education budget. The subjunctive mood, the instructor explained, is used for hypothetical situations. If I were free, I would go home. Sakamaki wrote the sentence in his notebook, then added his own. If we had known America's true strength, we would never have attacked. Back at Camp McCoy, Matsuo Abe progressed from alphabet drills to simple conversations within 3 weeks. His instructor, Sergeant William Hayes from Indiana, had taught high school English before the war. Now he taught enemy soldiers with the same patience he'd shown American teenagers. "Good morning, how are you?" Hayes prompted. "Good morning," Abe responded carefully. "I am fine, thank you." The simple exchange represented something profound. Two men whose nations were locked in brutal Pacific combat, speaking civilly across a wooden desk in Wisconsin. The absurdity of it was almost beautiful. The automotive mechanics program at Camp Livingston produced even more dramatic transformations. Japanese prisoners who'd never seen an internal combustion engine before military service learned to disassemble and rebuild carburetor systems, change transmission fluid, and diagnose electrical problems in Ford trucks. Private First Class Takeshi Ito, a fisherman's son from Okinawa, discovered he had a gift for mechanics. His instructor, Corporal Donald Price, noted in his monthly report, "Student Ito demonstrates exceptional aptitude, completed complete engine overhaul in half the expected time, requested additional technical manuals for independent study. The U.S. Army provided those manuals, advanced automotive engineering texts that American mechanics used, given freely to a Japanese prisoner of war." By spring 1945, the educational statistics told a story of unprecedented scope. Over 25,000 German and Japanese POWs had enrolled in college-level courses while in American captivity. 17 camps offered university programs through partnerships with nearby colleges. Prisoners could earn actual academic credits recognized by American institutions. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, a German physics professor taught advanced mathematics to both German POWs and interested American guards. The class met Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Nobody seemed to find this arrangement particularly strange anymore. Sergeant Shinji Yamamoto advanced to intermediate English by February 1945. He could read simple newspapers now, which created new problems. The headlines reported Japanese defeats with clinical precision. Iwo Jima falls after fierce resistance. Tokyo firebombed. Okinawa invasion begins. Each article reinforced what the POW camps had already taught him. Resistance was futile against a nation that could simultaneously wage global war and run universities behind barbed wire. In his hidden notebook, Yamamoto wrote, "Today I learned the English word opportunity. The instructor said, 'America is the land of opportunity, where any man can rise through education and hard work.' I thought this was propaganda. Then I remembered I am sitting in a classroom, learning for free while held prisoner. Perhaps it is true." The most radical program emerged at Camp Como, Mississippi, where the Army authorized a full high school equivalency curriculum. German prisoners who'd left school at 14 to join Hitler Youth could now earn diplomas recognized by the state of Mississippi. 23 prisoners graduated in June 1945. American guards attended the ceremony. There was cake. Master Sergeant Frank O'Brien, transferred from Camp Livingston to Como, watched the graduation with his characteristic skepticism, tempered by grudging admiration. His brother was still fighting in the Philippines, eating K rations and dodging artillery. Meanwhile, O'Brien was coordinating cake delivery for German POW graduates. The contrast should have enraged him. Somehow it didn't, because O'Brien understood what the POWs were slowly learning. America's power was so overwhelming that it could afford gestures of humanity that looked like weakness, but were actually displays of dominance. "You think the Nazis are running schools in their labor camps?" O'Brien asked a junior officer. "You think Tojo's giving American prisoners college courses?" The answer was obvious. American POWs in Japanese camps were dying of deliberate starvation. German camps worked prisoners to death in mines and factories. Education wasn't even a distant consideration. Only America looked at captured enemies and saw potential students. By war's end, the education programs had produced tangible results beyond the statistics. Japanese prisoners returned to a devastated homeland with English language skills, mechanical training, and, most dangerous of all, ideas about democracy, individual rights, and the rule of law. Matsuo Abe went home to Hokkaido with a Camp McCoy certificate of completion in English and automotive mechanics. In 1947, he opened the first Western-style auto repair shop in his prefecture, using skills learned from American instructors, while technically a prisoner of war. Commander Sakamaki carried something even more subversive: a complete education in American political philosophy from his Angel Island classes. His post-war memoir became a bestseller in Japan, not for tales of military glory, but for his descriptions of American educational opportunities, extended even to defeated enemies. The final accounting was preserved in a 1946 Provost Marshal General's report. 25,432 Axis POWs completed educational programs while in U.S. custody. Academic credits issued, 8,847. High school diplomas awarded, 127. College degrees earned, 9. That same report noted America had also trained 2.3 million of its own soldiers in specialized skills during the war, built 16 aircraft carriers, and produced 297,000 aircraft. The educational program for POWs represented 0.02% of total wartime expenditure. America had such overwhelming abundance that educating its enemies was literally a rounding error in the national budget. And those educated enemies went home carrying the most dangerous weapon of all, the proven example that democracy, abundance, and human dignity weren't propaganda lies, but observable facts. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, who'd initially dismissed the classes as tricks, enrolled in American history during his final months at Camp McCoy. He never spoke about what he learned there, but when he returned to Japan in late 1945, he didn't rejoin the scattered remnants of militarist organizations. He became a teacher instead. The morphine hit Isamu Noguchi's bloodstream like warm water spreading through ice. The 22-year-old naval rating stopped screaming. His shattered leg, torn open by American shrapnel during the Battle of Kwajalein, had felt like it was being devoured by fire ants for 3 days straight. Now, lying in the impossibly clean infirmary at Camp Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, he waited for the torture to begin. The American nurse, Lieutenant Dorothy Chen, returned with a syringe filled with yellowish liquid. Noguchi's remaining strength gathered for one final act of defiance. His instructors had been clear. The Americans were demons who would defile prisoners, experiment on them like laboratory rats, commit atrocities that would make death a mercy. This is penicillin. Lieutenant Chen said through the interpreter, a Japanese-American corporal named James Yamada. It will fight the infection in your leg. Noguchi closed his eyes. This was the moment. Whatever barbaric American science they were about to inject into his body, he would face it as a son of the emperor should. The needle pierced his skin. He felt the fluid enter his muscle. Then nothing. No burning. No convulsions. Just the morphine's gentle weight and the nurse's footsteps retreating across the wooden floor. 3 days later, his fever broke. The angry red lines spreading from his wound, the telltale signs of blood poisoning that should have killed him, began to fade. By the end of the week, he was sitting up. By the end of the month, he was walking with crutches. Lieutenant Chen had saved his life with a drug most Japanese soldiers had never heard of. At Camp Livingston in Louisiana, Private First Class Haruto Tanaka sat in a different kind of medical facility, one without bars on the windows. The camp dentist, Captain Richard Morton from Philadelphia, was examining Tanaka's teeth with the casual efficiency of a man who'd done this 10,000 times. 3 cavities, Captain Morton said to his assistant. We'll fill them next Tuesday. Tanaka understood enough English to grasp the meaning. Dental work for a prisoner. The concept scrambled his brain worse than any interrogation could have. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, enlisted men received dental care only if an infection threatened their ability to work. Cavities were ignored until teeth rotted and fell out. He'd watched his own father lose 6 teeth by age 35. Now, an American military dentist was scheduling appointments to fill a prisoner's cavities with actual silver amalgam. The care that Tanaka's captors were providing exceeded what he'd received as a free citizen of the Japanese Empire. The medical statistics told a story that Japanese propaganda couldn't explain away. By March 1945, the U.S. military medical system treating POWs across America had performed 127,000 dental procedures, 8,400 surgical operations, and distributed 340 tons of pharmaceutical supplies to prisoner infirmaries. Every camp had a dedicated medical facility staffed with trained doctors and nurses. Serious cases were transferred to military hospitals, where POWs received the same treatment as American servicemen. Commander Kazuo Sakamaki, prisoner number 1 from Pearl Harbor, sat in the medical library at Camp Angel Island, reading a textbook on sulfa drugs. His appendix had ruptured in February. An American surgeon had operated immediately, saving his life with techniques that wouldn't reach Japanese military hospitals for another decade. Now recovering, Sakamaki spent his days in the medical library, reading journals in English about advances in antibiotics, blood transfusions, and surgical sterilization. Back home in Japan, military hospitals were running out of basic bandages. Doctors performed amputations without anesthesia. Wounded soldiers died from infections that a single dose of American penicillin could have cured. Sakamaki knew this because he'd served on a destroyer where the medical officer kept exactly 3 morphine doses for a crew of 250 men. The Americans gave morphine to prisoners for broken bones. It makes no logical sense, Sakamaki wrote in his secret diary, the one he kept hidden beneath his mattress. If they possess such medical miracles, such abundance of healing, why do they need to conquer others? A nation that can manufacture penicillin by the ton does not need Japan's resources. At Camp McCoy, Sergeant Shinji Yamamoto sat across from the camp doctor, Major Thomas Fletcher, for his monthly health assessment. It was April 1945. Yamamoto had been a prisoner for 20 months. "You've gained 18 pounds since arrival," Major Fletcher said through interpreter George Tanaka. "Blood pressure normal. No signs of malnutrition or disease. You're healthier now than when we captured you." Yamamoto nodded slowly. He'd noticed his uniform fitting tighter. His face had filled out. The chronic stomach pain he'd suffered since 1942, from subsisting on rice and pickled vegetables while serving in the Aleutians, had vanished after 3 months of American prison food. Major Fletcher made a notation in Yamamoto's file. We're starting to see vitamin deficiencies in some of the prisoners who were captured early in the war. Scurvy, beriberi, things like that. We're adjusting their diets accordingly. After the appointment, Yamamoto walked across the compound in a daze. The Americans were treating vitamin deficiencies in prisoners, not just keeping them alive, but optimizing their health. The cognitive dissonance was so severe he felt physically dizzy. That night, he added another entry to his hidden notebook. The enemy's medical care proves they fight from a position of such strength they can afford to heal us. This is not mercy. This is dominance so complete it masquerades as kindness. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Letters from home, heavily censored but still revealing, spoke of starvation rations, entire cities leveled by bombing, children dying from preventable diseases. Meanwhile, at Camp Clarinda in Iowa, Japanese POW Corporal Kenji Sato was recovering from pneumonia in a heated infirmary, receiving twice-daily doses of the new miracle drug streptomycin. Sato's younger brother had died of pneumonia in 1943 in Osaka. There had been no medicine, no hospital bed, just a fevered death in a cold apartment, while American B-29s flew overhead. Now, Sato lay in clean sheets, his lungs clearing, his fever controlled by American pharmaceuticals that cost more than his father earned in a year. The Americans were spending this fortune on an enemy prisoner. Master Sergeant Frank O'Brien, the logistics specialist from Camp Livingston, reviewed the medical supply requisitions with the same attention he gave to food orders. Penicillin, 4,800 doses monthly. Morphine, 2,200 ampules. Surgical supplies, enough to stock a field hospital, all for prisoners of war. Sir, the morphine shipment for the POW infirmary exceeds what some frontline aid stations are receiving, a young lieutenant mentioned during their supply meeting. O'Brien looked up from his paperwork. The Provost Marshal's orders are clear. Geneva Convention compliance. No exceptions. If our boys are suffering in Japanese camps, we prove we're better by how we treat theirs. The lieutenant nodded, but O'Brien saw the question in his eyes. His brother was still missing after the fall of Corregidor. Every dose of morphine that went to a Japanese prisoner was a dose that might have eased an American soldier's pain somewhere. But that was the point. That was the whole damned point. America could afford to do both, could afford to fight a global war and still treat enemy prisoners with medical care that exceeded what most civilian populations received. That abundance, that casual display of overwhelming resources, was its own form of warfare. Back at Camp Angel Island, Isamu Noguchi took his first steps without crutches. Lieutenant Chen watched from the doorway, making notes for his file. The young sailor's leg had healed perfectly. In 6 months, he'd be repatriated to Japan. But something else had changed in those months of recovery. Noguchi had watched American doctors save Japanese lives with the same urgency they'd show for American patients. He'd seen nurses work double shifts to care for prisoners. He'd received medications that cost more than his father's house. The propaganda had promised torture. Instead, he'd received mercy from a nation so powerful it could afford to heal its enemies while defeating their empire. That night, Noguchi wrote his first letter home in months. The censors would read it. The censors would probably redact most of it, but he had to try. Mother, I cannot describe what I have seen, except to say that everything we were told was a lie. The Americans are not demons. They are something I have no words for. They are winning this war with medicine as surely as with bombs. The final statistic emerged from Provost Marshal General Records in late 1945, and it told the whole story in numbers that couldn't be argued with. Mortality rate for American POWs held in Japanese camps, 40%. 40 men out of every 100 died from deliberate starvation, disease, abuse, and execution. Mortality rate for Japanese POWs held in American camps, 0.9%, less than 1 man per 100, and most of those from diseases contracted before capture or conditions too severe for even American medicine to reverse. This wasn't an accident of war. This wasn't even strategy in the conventional sense. This was a demonstration of such overwhelming superiority that America could afford to keep its enemies alive and healthy while simultaneously destroying their ability to make war. The Japanese military had taught its soldiers that surrender meant torture and death. So America responded by providing medical care that most Japanese civilians would never receive, by healing wounds instead of inflicting them, by proving that every single thing the imperial propaganda machine had said was a calculated lie. Commander Sakamaki would carry this truth home with him. So would Noguchi and Tanaka and Sato and thousands of others. They would return to a shattered Japan, carrying the memory of American penicillin and morphine and surgical steel. They would remember that the enemy had healed them when their own nation had prepared them only for death. That was the victory that Hollywood couldn't film and historians would struggle to quantify. America had killed the ideology of Bushido, not with bullets, but with antibiotics, had destroyed the myth of American barbarism, not with propaganda, but with thermometers and blood pressure cuffs and dental fillings. The kindness wasn't weakness. The medical care wasn't charity. It was dominance so absolute that America could afford to save the lives of men who had sworn to die for their emperor. The garbage dump stretched across 5 acres of the Los Angeles basin like a monument to excess.
Sergeant Kiyoshi Kamiko stood behind the chain-link fence, flanked by 8 other Japanese POWs on work detail, staring at what his mind refused to process. Mountains of discarded furniture, intact wooden crates, automobile tires stacked 20 feet high, and food, dear God, the food, whole loaves of bread, barely stale, canned goods with dented labels, produce crates half full of oranges and lettuce. Corporal Danny Morrison from Ohio leaned against the truck, smoking a Camel. "Yeah, it's a mess. City's talking about opening a second dump site next year." Kamiko's hands trembled. He'd seen the Hollywood films at Camp Livingston, dismissed them as elaborate propaganda, trick photography, sets built to deceive. The abundance in those moving pictures, the massive homes, the automobiles in every driveway, the overflowing grocery stores, had to be lies designed to break Japanese morale. But this garbage dump was real. He could smell the rotting oranges, see the chrome bumper on a discarded Plymouth that probably cost more than his family's entire farm in Hokkaido. Private Takeshi Ito whispered in Japanese, "The amount they throw away could feed my village for a month." "Be silent," Kamiko hissed, but the words lacked conviction. Morrison tossed his cigarette. "All right, fellas, we're hauling scrap metal today. Anything iron or steel goes in the truck. War Production Board wants every ounce we can salvage." Kamiko climbed into the dump, boots sinking into layers of American excess. He lifted a perfectly good steel bucket, its only crime a small rust spot on the handle. In Japan, this would be treasured, repaired, passed down through generations. Here, it was garbage. The work detail filled the truck bed in silence. Each discarded item, bicycle frames, cast iron skillets, metal bed frames, represented wealth beyond comprehension. Kamiko found himself doing calculations that made his head swim. This single dump site, one of dozens around Los Angeles alone, contained more material goods than existed in his entire prefecture back home. "Hey, Sarge," Morrison called out, offering Kamiko a canteen of cold water. "You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Kamiko accepted the water because his mouth had gone dry. The casual kindness, offering drink to an enemy who'd been trained to kill Americans, no longer shocked him. After 8 months at Camp Livingston, he'd grown accustomed to small mercies that violated everything his officers had taught. What shocked him was the realization crystallizing with each discarded tire, each thrown-away tool. Japan had attacked this nation, declared war on this industrial colossus that threw away more material than the emperor's entire military could produce. "I am fine," Kamiko managed in careful English. "Just hot day." That night in the barracks at Camp Livingston, Kamiko sat at the crude wooden desk, a stub of pencil in his hand. The letter he was writing would be censored, read by American
intelligence before it ever reached Japan. He didn't care anymore. "Mother and Father, I witnessed something today that I must tell you, though you may not believe me. The Americans took us to one of their city garbage dumps. What I saw there has troubled me more than any battlefield." He paused, choosing words that might survive the censor's pen. "The discarded materials in this single location exceeded the total possessions of our entire village. I saw whole automobile tires, not worn but simply replaced because they were old. I saw furniture that would grace a merchant's home, thrown away for minor scratches. I saw food, Mother. Actual food, wasted because it was no longer fresh enough for American standards." Across the barracks, Sergeant Shinji Yamamoto approached with his usual evening cup of coffee from the canteen. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute Japanese civilians had been drinking since 1942. "Writing home again?" Yamamoto asked. Kamiko nodded. "Trying to explain what we saw today. They won't believe it." Yamamoto sat on the adjacent bunk. "I wrote my brother about the movie nights, the baseball games, the medical care." He wrote back asking if I'd been tortured into writing propaganda. "Were we lied to about everything?" The question escaped before Kamiko could stop it. Yamamoto sipped his coffee, considering. "I've been asking myself that for months. The answer keeps getting clearer." Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura joined them, his face troubled. 3 months ago, he'd been organizing resistance cells, planning escapes that never materialized. Now he spent evenings studying English from American textbooks. "The afternoon newspaper had a photograph," Nakamura said quietly. "Manila. Our forces. The casualties." He couldn't finish. The 3 men sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the camp. Someone playing harmonica, laughter from the German POW section next door. The distant rumble of American trucks delivering tomorrow's supplies. Beef, fresh vegetables, flour for bread that would exceed the rations Japanese civilians received. Kamiko returned to his letter. "I do not know how to explain what it means to fight a nation with such abundance. You asked in your last letter when I thought the war would end. Father, I believe now it ended before it began. We simply did not know it yet. The Americans treat us with care not because they fear us, but because they can afford to. They feed us better than our own army fed us. They provide medical care superior to what our officers received. And they do this while simultaneously fighting Germany, while building ships faster than we can sink them, while producing aircraft that darken their skies. I saw today what true industrial power looks like. It looks like waste. It looks like throwing away in one afternoon more than an entire village produces in a year. This is not a nation we could ever defeat. This is barely a nation we should have annoyed." He signed the letter, knowing every word would be read by Captain Robert Morrison or another intelligence officer. Let them read it. Let them understand that the dump site had accomplished what months of movies and baseball games had begun, the complete erosion of his belief in inevitable Japanese victory. Master Sergeant Frank O'Brien made his evening rounds, checking the barracks, counting heads. He paused at Kamiko's desk. "Letter home, Sergeant?" "Yes." Kamiko held up the pages. "About the work detail today." O'Brien nodded slowly. "The dump site affects a lot of you boys that way. That's why Colonel Rogers approved the detail." He started to leave, then turned back. "For what it's worth, we're not trying to rub your noses in it, but you fellows needed to see the reality with your own eyes." After O'Brien departed, Private Ito approached Kamiko's desk. "What you wrote, about the war being over before it started, do you truly believe that?" Kamiko looked at the younger man, remembering his own certainty back in 1941.
the propaganda films showing American weakness and decadence, the promises of quick victory over a soft, divided enemy. I saw their garbage today, Ito. Mountains of it, more wealth in their trash than in our treasuries. He folded the letter carefully. Yes, I believe it. The next morning, Captain Harold Hoskins read Kamiko's intercepted letter in his office at Camp Livingston headquarters. He made careful notes, adding it to his growing file of psychological warfare assessment reports. The dump site visits had been his idea, implemented across camps in California and Texas. Show them Hollywood movies, and they might dismiss it as propaganda. Show them a baseball game, and they might think it an isolated example. But show them a garbage dump. Show them the casual, thoughtless waste of a nation so wealthy it literally threw away more than their homeland could produce. And something fundamental broke in their understanding of the war. Hoskins attached Kamiko's letter to his monthly report for Major General Alan W. Gullion's office. In the summary section, he wrote, Asterisk effectiveness of dump site exposure, extremely high. Subject POWs experience rapid ideological erosion when confronted with undeniable physical evidence of American industrial superiority. Recommend expanding program to all West Coast camps with access to municipal waste facilities. Asterisk the statistics told their own story. By May 1945, the United States produced more military equipment in 6 months than Japan had manufactured in the entire war. American factories built a bomber every 63 minutes, a Liberty ship every 24 hours. The gross domestic product of the United States exceeded that of Japan, Germany, and Italy combined, by a factor of 3. And America was so dominant, so overwhelmingly superior in every measurable category, that it could afford to take enemy prisoners on field trips to garbage dumps just to prove a point. At Camp Clarinda, Iowa, German POWs heard about the dump site visits from their Japanese counterparts. Oberst Friedrich Weber, a captured Luftwaffe officer, made his own observations in a diary later seized by camp authorities. The Americans do not merely defeat their enemies militarily. They psychologically dominate through demonstration of abundance. When a nation can afford to waste more than its enemies can produce, traditional warfare becomes obsolete. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an economic engine that treats war as simply another manufacturing problem to solve. 3 weeks after the dump site visit, Kamiko received a reply from his family. His mother's shaky handwriting covered 2 pages of rice paper. She wrote of hunger in their village, of the latest round of metal requisitions, where the army had taken their cooking pots and farm tools, of neighbors who'd lost sons in the Philippines, and in the final paragraph, a sentence that broke his heart. If what you describe is true, why did our leaders send you to fight such a nation? Kamiko had no answer. He folded the letter and placed it in his footlocker, next to the clean American uniform, the English textbook from the camp education program, and the baseball signed by his entire team after their tournament victory last month. Outside, Corporal Morrison's voice echoed across the compound. Work detail. Same crew as last week. Truck leaves in 10 minutes. Kamiko stood, grabbed his cap, and joined the line. They were returning to the dump site. This time he would bring a camera. The camp allowed prisoners to purchase them from the canteen. Private First Class Frank Fu Fujita walked the perimeter of Camp Trinidad, with his rifle slung casually across his shoulder, watching the morning formation split into 2 distinct groups. On the western quad, 247 German prisoners lined up in precise rows that would make a Prussian drill sergeant weep with pride. On the eastern quad, 189 Japanese POWs formed their own tight formation, faces carved from stone. What happened next stopped Fujita cold. Both groups marched to the same mess hall, through the same doors, to eat the same breakfast. Oberst Friedrich Weber, a decorated U-boat commander who'd sent 14 Allied ships to the bottom of the Atlantic, stood frozen at the mess hall entrance. He watched Japanese Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura collect his tray, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, from the same serving line Weber himself would use in 30 seconds. "They eat what we eat?" Weber asked Fujita in careful English. "Geneva Convention applies to everyone, sir." Weber's face did something complicated. "You give them pork?" "We give everyone pork. It's Tuesday." The German officer sat at a table near the window, mechanically cutting his bacon while his eyes tracked the Japanese prisoners. Sergeant Shinji Yamamoto caught Weber's stare and nodded once. The barest acknowledgement between old allies who'd never actually met. What Weber couldn't wrap his head around was this. Japan had attacked America without warning. The photographs from Pearl Harbor showed American sailors burning alive in their ships. Japanese forces had tortured American POWs, executed them for sport, performed medical experiments that made Mengele look restrained. And America was serving them bacon and eggs. "I do not understand your country," Weber said to Corporal Danny Morrison, who was supervising the morning meal. "The Japanese violated every rule of civilized warfare, yet you treat them exactly as you treat us." Morrison shrugged. "Rules are rules. We don't change them based on who breaks them first. That is either supreme wisdom or supreme foolishness. Probably both," Morrison said. "But it's the American way." By 1945, Camp Trinidad held what the military classified as high-risk ideological prisoners, Nazi true believers and die-hard Japanese militarists who'd never accepted defeat. These weren't farm boys drafted into a bad situation. These were the men who'd drunk the Kool-Aid and asked for seconds. The camp commander, Colonel William Jameson, ran the facility with the kind of rigid fairness that drove both prisoner groups absolutely insane. When German prisoners complained that Japanese POWs received the same recreation time despite being racially inferior allies, Jameson's response entered camp legend. "In America, we believe all men are created equal. You can spend your recreation time thinking about what that means." When Japanese prisoners protested being housed in the same facility as white Europeans, a violation of the racial hierarchy they'd been taught since childhood, Jameson's reply was even simpler. "You're all prisoners. You'll all be treated the same." The cognitive dissonance was beautiful to witness. Master Sergeant Frank O'Brien, making his regular supply coordination visit to Camp Trinidad, observed what he privately called the cultural collision. German prisoners who'd fought alongside Japan watching their former allies receive identical treatment to themselves. Japanese prisoners who'd been taught Germans were superior, witnessing Americans treat both groups with the same procedural dignity. O'Brien's logistics report to the Provost Marshal General's office included a stunning detail. Camp Trinidad went through 1,847 pounds of beef per week feeding both populations. The same week, German civilians in occupied Berlin were rioting over 200-gram bread rations. Japanese civilians in Tokyo were eating tree bark. America was feeding its most fanatical enemies better than their own governments had ever fed them. The breaking point came during a mandatory educational assembly in April 1945. Colonel Jameson screened newsreel footage of the liberation of Buchenwald concentration camp. He wanted both prisoner populations to see what Nazi Germany had actually accomplished. The German prisoners sat in stunned, shameful silence as the skeletal survivors stumbled past American cameras. Then Jameson screened footage of American troops liberating POW camps in the Philippines. Japanese guards had starved prisoners to walking skeletons, forced death marches, executed the weak. Weber and Nakamura sat 6 rows apart, watching their respective nations' war crimes projected on a mess hall wall. After the screening, Jameson stood at the podium. "Gentlemen, you've now seen what your governments did to their prisoners. Look around this room. Look at the meals you eat, the medical care you receive, the beds you sleep in. America had every justification to treat you the way you treated our men. We chose not to. Think about what that means." The silence that followed was so heavy it had weight. Private Takeshi Ito, who'd been at Camp Trinidad for 3 months after transfer from Camp Livingston, wrote in his diary that night, "The German prisoners look at us with something I have never seen before. Not hatred, not alliance. Something like shared shame. We believed different lies, but we were both lied to about the Americans." Weber, for his part, requested a meeting with Colonel Jameson the next morning. "I wish to understand," the U-boat commander said carefully, "how your nation can afford this treatment. The logistics alone." Jameson cut him off with a smile. "Commander, while we're feeding you gentlemen breakfast, American factories are producing 1 Liberty ship every 4 days, 1 B-24 bomber every hour, and enough ammunition to fight simultaneous wars across 2 oceans. Feeding 425,000 prisoners costs us 0.09% of our war budget. We spend more on paint for our aircraft." Weber sat back in his chair like he'd been punched. "You're not just fighting us," Jameson continued. "You're fighting an industrial capacity that exceeds the entire Axis combined. We can afford to be humane because we're so overwhelmingly superior that mercy doesn't even slow us down." The German officer left that meeting and went straight to the camp library. He spent the next 3 days reading American industrial production statistics in old Life magazines. The numbers made him physically ill. Meanwhile, Sergeant Shinji Yamamoto was having his own revelation in the camp workshop. He'd volunteered for the woodworking detail, where POWs built furniture for camp use. The American supervisor, Sergeant Hayes, provided them with professional-grade tools, saws, planes, chisels, measuring equipment that exceeded what Yamamoto had used in civilian life back in Japan. "Why do you give us such good tools?" Yamamoto asked in his improving English. Hayes looked up from his newspaper. "Because good tools make good work. You think we're going to give you garbage equipment and expect quality furniture? But we are enemies. You're prisoners doing a job. Job deserves proper tools." That casual American pragmatism, that absolute refusal to let ideology interfere with efficiency, was more devastating than any propaganda film. Yamamoto mentioned it to Nakamura that evening during their permitted recreation hour. The lieutenant, whose fanaticism had been eroding since his arrival at Camp Trinidad, finally articulated what both men were thinking. "They have already won," Nakamura said quietly. "Not because they defeated us in battle, because they built a system so abundant, so efficient, so confident that they can afford to treat their worst enemies better than our own government treated its loyal citizens." From across the recreation yard, Weber overheard the conversation. He walked over slowly, aware that approaching Japanese prisoners was technically allowed but socially complicated. "Forgive the intrusion," Weber said in deliberate English, "but I believe I understand what you mean. My government told me America was weak, decadent, incapable of sacrifice. Then they put me in a camp with excellent food, medical care, and professional tools for our work details." Nakamura nodded. "They told us Americans were barbarians without honor. Then they gave us baseball equipment and college textbooks. The 2 officers, allies in a war they were losing, stood together in the Colorado sunset and realized they'd been fighting against something they'd never properly understood." Sergeant Yamamoto watched them and thought about the letter he'd received from his mother last week. She'd written about the starvation in their village, about neighbors dying from malnutrition, about the military police confiscating their last bag of rice for the war effort. He'd gained 17 pounds at Camp Trinidad. That night, Fujita filed his weekly report to Captain Harold Hoskins, the psychological warfare specialist tracking Camp Trinidad's unique population. The report included a stunning observation. German and Japanese prisoners were starting to talk to each other. Not as allies, as fellow survivors of governments that had lied to them about everything. "The ideological breakdown is accelerating," Fujita wrote. "Exposure to American abundance and procedural fairness is doing more damage to enemy morale than any battle. Recommend continuing current policies." Hoskins read the report in his Washington office and smiled. America was winning a war most of the enemy didn't even know they were fighting. A war fought with bacon and eggs, professional woodworking tools, and the revolutionary idea that rules apply to everyone equally. The guard tower cast a long shadow across the baseball diamond at Camp McCoy, but nobody was watching the perimeter. Every eye, American and Japanese alike, fixed on the bulletin board where Colonel Horace Rogers had just posted a single sheet of paper. August 15th, 1945. The war was over. Sergeant Shinji Yamamoto stood motionless, reading the words in English he now understood perfectly. 2 years ago, he'd arrived at this camp expecting torture. Yesterday, he'd pitched a perfect game against the German POW team. Today, the Empire of Japan had surrendered unconditionally. "Sergeant Yamamoto, could you come to my office, please?" Colonel Rogers stood at the administration building doorway, his tone careful, almost gentle. Inside, Rogers gestured to a chair. Yamamoto sat, spine rigid, the old military discipline surfacing despite everything that had changed. 3 other Japanese prisoners waited. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, whose fanaticism had crumbled over 18 months of American abundance. Private Takeshi Ito, who'd become the camp's best automotive mechanic, and Commander Kazuo Sakamaki, the first POW captured at Pearl Harbor. "Gentlemen," Rogers began, consulting a notepad, "the War Department has authorized immediate repatriation processing. Ships will begin transporting you home within 6 weeks." He paused. "I wanted to speak with you personally because you've been model prisoners, and frankly, I'll miss our chess games." Sakamaki cleared his throat. "Colonel, we have discussed this among ourselves. We wish to make a formal request." Rogers leaned forward. "We wish to know the procedure for applying for American citizenship." The silence stretched like a wire ready to snap. Rogers' face went blank. He looked at each man in turn, searching for the punchline to an impossible joke. "I don't understand," Rogers said finally. Yamamoto spoke up, his English carrying only a trace of accent now. "We have seen your country, Colonel. We have lived in it. We understand now what we were fighting against." He pulled a worn photograph from his pocket, his mother and sister in Hokkaido, their faces gaunt with wartime hunger. "This arrived 3 months ago. My village has nothing. No food, no medicine, no hope. Here, even your prisoners have more than our civilians." Nakamura added quietly, "The Emperor's broadcast today spoke of enduring the unendurable. But we have seen what enduring looks like in America. You endure by building more, producing more, being more. Japan's unendurable is different. It means accepting we believed lies. Our commanders told us Americans were devils," Ito said, "that you would torture and kill us. Instead, you taught me to rebuild car engines. You gave me skills I never could have learned in the Imperial Navy." His voice cracked. "How do I go back to a country that lied about everything?" Rogers pulled off his glasses, cleaning them slowly. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "This is above my pay grade." He looked at the 4 men. "You understand that even if I forward this request, and I will, the odds of approval are astronomical. You're enemy combatants. You fought against us." "We know," Sakamaki said, "but we must try. Because returning to Japan means living with men who still believe the old lies, who will call us weak for surviving, who will never understand what we learned here." Rogers stood pacing. "I need to contact the Provost Marshal General's office. This situation, hell, I don't think we even have protocols for this." Turned back to them. "Stay here. I'm making a phone call." While Rogers worked the telephone in the outer office, the 4 prisoners sat in silence. Through the window they could see other Japanese POWs gathering in clusters, reading the surrender announcement, their faces showing relief, fear, confusion, resignation. "They will hate us," Nakamura said softly. "The ones who go back and still believe. They will say we were corrupted." "We were," Yamamoto replied. "Corrupted by 3 meals a day. Corrupted by baseball and movies and the realization that our government spent more on battleships than on our people's lives." He met Nakamura's eyes. "I am not ashamed of this corruption." Rogers returned, his expression unreadable. "I spoke with Major General Davidson's office. They're conferring with the State Department." He sat heavily. "Gentlemen, I'm going to be straight with you. The bureaucratic nightmare this represents is extraordinary. Immigration law, wartime enemy alien status, the political optics of former Japanese military personnel seeking to become Americans, while our boys are still coming home from your POW camps. We understand," Sakamaki interrupted. "We watched American soldiers build this camp. We saw how you solve impossible problems through organization and determination. We are asking you to apply that to us." Rogers studied the commander. "You're prisoner number 1, first Japanese POW of the war. If anyone has reason to hate America, it's you. That is precisely why I must stay," Sakamaki said. "I have seen both sides now. I know what I am choosing." The telephone rang. Rogers grabbed it, listened, his eyebrows rising. "Yes, sir. I understand, sir. I'll inform them." He hung up slowly. "That was General Davidson himself. He says your request has been forwarded to Washington with his personal recommendation for consideration." Rogers shook his head in wonder. "He also said to tell you that regardless of the outcome, your request is the finest evidence he's seen that American policy toward prisoners of war achieved exactly what it was designed to do." "Which was what?" Ito asked. "To prove that our way of life, democracy, abundance, human dignity, wasn't propaganda. It was real, and it was worth defending." Rogers straightened. "The general also said that while your applications are being processed, you're being transferred to a special detachment at Fort Snelling, Minnesota. They need interpreters and cultural advisors for the occupation force being assembled for Japan." Yamamoto felt something break loose in his chest. "You would trust us with that?" "Son, you just asked to become Americans. Yeah, we trust you with that." Rogers extended his hand. "Welcome to the most complicated immigration case in U.S. history." 3 months later, Master Sergeant Frank O'Brien stood in the Camp McCoy administrative building, overseeing the final repatriation processing. The camp was nearly empty now. Most of the Japanese prisoners had already shipped out to San Francisco for transport home. He held a file marked Special Cases, Fort Snelling Transfer. Inside were the applications of 17 Japanese POWs who'd requested to remain in America. Most would eventually be denied. The political climate and legal barriers were insurmountable. But the requests themselves sat in the National Archives now, permanent evidence of what had happened here. O'Brien thought about his brother Tom, who'd survived the Bataan Death March and weighed 89 pounds when MacArthur's forces liberated him. Tom was in a San Diego hospital now, recovering slowly, haunted by memories of casual brutality and systematic starvation. The contrast wasn't lost on O'Brien. His logistical reports documented a reality that seemed impossible. America had fought a total war while simultaneously operating what amounted to a rehabilitation program for enemy soldiers. The same military that firebombed Tokyo also made sure Japanese POWs got dental care and college courses. "Sergeant," a young corporal approached, "we've got the final count. 4,837 Japanese POWs repatriated. 17 transferred to Fort Snelling. 0 deaths during final processing." "0," O'Brien repeated. He thought of the 1% overall mortality rate for Japanese POWs in American custody versus the 40% rate for Americans in Japanese camps. "Make sure that number gets in the final report. People need to understand what we did here." "What did we do here, Sergeant?" O'Brien looked around the empty barracks, the baseball field, the classroom buildings. "We won a war they don't teach in tactics manuals, Corporal. We won it with fried chicken and movie nights, and the radical idea that even our enemies deserved to be treated like human beings." He closed the file, and some of them noticed. At Fort Snelling, Yamamoto sat in a classroom, teaching American soldiers basic Japanese phrases they'd need for occupation duty. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was preparing the men who would govern his homeland, teaching them how to communicate with people who still believed the propaganda he'd once accepted without question. During breaks, he worked on his citizenship application paperwork. Knowing the odds were against approval, it didn't matter. The act of asking, the statement it represented, was its own form of victory. He'd gained 23 pounds since his capture. He spoke English fluently. He understood baseball rules, American history, and the machinery of democratic government. He'd seen garbage dumps that contained more wealth than his entire village. He'd watched movies where ordinary citizens criticized their leaders without fear. He'd received medical care that saved his life, and education that transformed his mind. Commander Sakamaki worked in the next classroom, preparing cultural briefings for officers bound for Tokyo. In his spare time, he was writing a memoir, not about the glory of war or the shame of capture, but about the completely unexpected experience of being treated with dignity by the nation he'd attacked. The book would become a bestseller in Japan. It would puzzle some readers and enrage others, but it would plant seeds, small questions about the nature of the enemy they'd fought, the lies they'd been told, the possibilities they'd never imagined. Lieutenant Nakamura, working as a translator, received a letter from his brother in Osaka. It described the devastation, the hunger, the occupation forces arriving with food and supplies. "The Americans are not what we were told," his brother wrote. "They are rebuilding what they destroyed. I do not understand this." Nakamura wrote back carefully, knowing censors would read every word. "I have lived among them for 2 years. What you are seeing now, I have experienced. They are exactly what they claimed to be. That was always the most dangerous thing about them." The final statistics would tell a story so extreme it seemed like propaganda. Except every number was documented, verified, recorded, in official reports that sat in government archives for decades. Japanese POWs in American custody gained an average of 17 pounds. American POWs in Japanese custody lost an average of 43 pounds. Japanese POWs attended 25,432 educational courses. American POWs in Japanese custody attended virtually none, surviving instead on meager rations and brutal labor. The trucks lined up at Camp McCoy's gates in October 1945 weren't carrying supplies this time. They were carrying men home. Sergeant Shinji Yamamoto stood in the processing line with 147 other Japanese POWs, holding a duffel bag containing his few possessions. 3 notebooks filled with English vocabulary, a signed baseball from the camp tournament, a photograph of the American family who'd invited him to Thanksgiving dinner, and a letter from his mother he couldn't bear to throw away. The letter had arrived in April, just before Germany surrendered. His mother's handwriting was shaky, the characters formed by a hand weakened by hunger. She described eating tree bark soup. She wrote that his younger sister had died of malnutrition in February. She asked if the Americans who captured him had killed him quickly, because that would be a mercy compared to what was happening at home. Yamamoto had gained 23 pounds in American captivity. His sister had starved to death in Japan. He looked down the line at faces he knew. Private Takeshi Ito, who'd learned to rebuild carburetors in the automotive mechanics class and now carried a certificate of completion in his bag. Corporal Kenji Sato, who'd survived pneumonia thanks to American antibiotics and spent his recovery reading Mark Twain in the camp library. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, the officer who'd once threatened to kill any man who cooperated with the Americans, now spoke better English than half the guards. The processing officer, A young lieutenant named Bradford checked names against manifests with efficient precision. Yamamoto, Shinji, Sergeant. Captured Attu Island, June 1943. Yes, sir. The English came automatically now. Bradford looked up, studying Yamamoto's face. Says here you completed 3 educational courses: English, American history, and agricultural science. Yes, sir. I want to help rebuild my country. The lieutenant's expression softened for just a moment. He stamped a form. Good luck, Sergeant. The world's going to need men like you. Yamamoto moved to the next station where Master Sergeant Frank O'Brien was distributing departure packages. 2 years of observing prisoners had left O'Brien with a strange kind of respect for these men. They'd arrived expecting torture and death. They were leaving with skills, education, and a fundamentally altered understanding of what their enemy actually looked like. Yamamoto. O'Brien handed him a sealed box. Standard issue. Clean clothes, personal effects, 2 weeks' rations for the voyage, and a care package from the Red Cross. Yamamoto accepted the box, then did something that still made O'Brien's throat tight. He bowed deeply, the formal bow of profound respect. Thank you, Sergeant O'Brien, for everything. You take care of yourself. O'Brien's voice was gruff. And you tell people back home what you saw here. I will, I promise. At the medical station, Dr. Thomas Fletcher was conducting final health assessments. Each man stepped on a scale, had his vitals checked, received a medical clearance form for the transport ship. Fletcher kept meticulous records because he understood these numbers would tell a story that needed telling. Yamamoto, up on the scale. The needle settled at 178 pounds. Fletcher checked his intake form from June 1943. The prisoner had weighed 155 pounds on arrival, malnourished from months of reduced rations on Attu before capture. You're cleared for travel. You're healthy. Fletcher handed him the form, then added quietly, You gained 23 pounds here, son. I hope you remember that when people ask you about American camps. The loaded trucks departed in a convoy, heading for the port of Seattle, where a transport ship waited. Inside one truck, Yamamoto sat between Ito and Nakamura, watching Wisconsin farmland roll past through the canvas opening. The fields were enormous, the barns built on a scale that dwarfed anything in Japan. Even in late autumn, the evidence of American agricultural abundance was staggering. What do we tell them? Ito asked quietly. When we get home and they ask what happened. Nakamura, who'd once been the hardest of the hardliners, stared at his hands. We tell them the truth, that we were treated better than our own military treated us, that the enemy we were told to hate showed us more humanity than our own commanders. He looked at Yamamoto. We tell them what you wrote in your diary that first week, that we thought we were in some strange afterlife where the devils fed us and taught us and let us play baseball. They won't believe us, Sato said. Some will, Yamamoto replied. Enough will. And when they see what the Americans are bringing to Japan, food, medicine, rebuilding, they'll have to believe. The truth was already spreading through different channels. Commander Kazuo Sakamaki had been repatriated earlier, and his memoir was being serialized in Japanese newspapers, despite occupation censors' concerns. His account of American POW camps was so contrary to wartime propaganda that many readers assumed it was forced collaboration. But Sakamaki's details were too specific, too consistent with what other returning prisoners reported. The cognitive dissonance was exactly what America needed to plant in Japanese society. At Fort Snelling, Minnesota, a smaller group of 17 Japanese POWs weren't heading home at all. They'd requested to remain in America, to work as translators and cultural advisors for the occupation forces. Their applications for citizenship faced legal obstacles that most would never overcome, but the request itself was a propaganda victory Washington couldn't have scripted. Among them was Sergeant Matsuo Abe, the farmer from Hokkaido who'd discovered a gift for languages in Camp McCoy's education program. He now taught Japanese to American officers preparing for occupation duty, explaining cultural nuances with the patience of a man who'd learned that understanding beats hatred. The concept of giri, he told a classroom of Army lieutenants, is obligation, but deeper. When I was captured, my giri to the Emperor said I should have died. American kindness created new giri, obligation to truth. His English was accented but precise. You will encounter many Japanese who cannot reconcile the propaganda they believed with the reality you represent. Be patient. Show them what you showed us. The statistics were being compiled in Washington, cold numbers that told the warmest story. The Provost Marshal General's final report on POW operations would show that 5,424 Japanese prisoners had been held in American camps during the war. The mortality rate was 0.9%, almost entirely from diseases contracted before capture. The average weight gain was 17.3 pounds. Voluntary participation in educational programs reached 68%. 0 documented cases of systematic abuse. The comparison numbers sat in a separate report, this one from the War Crimes Office. American POWs in Japanese camps, 40% mortality rate from deliberate starvation, disease, execution, and abuse. Average weight loss among survivors, 43 pounds. Documented cases of systematic torture, medical experimentation, and murder, thousands. 2 philosophies of warfare, 2 approaches to defeated enemies. One nation had proven its superiority through violence and cruelty. The other had proven its superiority through abundance and mercy. The transport ship General W.H. Gordon departed
Seattle on November 12, 1945, carrying 2,847 Japanese POWs home. Yamamoto stood at the rail as America receded into the fog, the Seattle skyline disappearing like a dream. In his pocket, he carried the photograph of the American family, the Johnsons of Madison, Wisconsin, who'd hosted him for Thanksgiving dinner through a Red Cross program. Mrs. Johnson had cried when she hugged him goodbye, told him she'd pray for his mother and for Japan's recovery. The enemy had wept for him. The sheer impossibility of that moment still left him shaken. Nakamura joined him at the rail. "What will you do when we arrive?" "Find my mother, feed her, then find work helping rebuild." Yamamoto pulled out his agricultural science certificate. "The Americans taught me about crop rotation, soil enrichment, modern farming. I'm going to teach others. They'll call you a traitor for praising the Americans. Let them. I lived in their camp for 2 years. I know what I saw." Yamamoto's voice was firm. "They defeated us with battleships and bombs, but they're going to win the peace with food and fairness. Someone needs to explain that to Japan, or we'll resist the occupation and make everything worse." Below decks, in the converted cargo holds, other conversations were happening in Japanese. Some men were processing what they'd experienced, trying to reconcile their indoctrination with reality. Others clung to the old beliefs, insisting the kind treatment had been an elaborate trick, that America's true nature would reveal itself once occupation began. But even the skeptics had to explain away their weight gain, their education, their unbroken bodies. PFC Frank Fujita's final report to Captain Harold Hoskins had predicted this internal conflict among returning prisoners. The psychological warfare hadn't ended with surrender. Every POW returning home was a potential seed of democratic thought, a living contradiction to the militarist narrative. Some seeds would take root, many wouldn't. But the soil had been prepared through 2 years of systematic exposure to American values. The numbers told the story of American victory in the starkest terms. Not the production statistics, though building 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and 2,700 ships, while feeding 425,000 prisoners, remained an almost supernatural achievement. Not the battle casualties, though the Pacific Campaign had proven American tactical and strategic superiority at every engagement. The real measure of victory
was simpler and more profound. The average weight difference between American POWs returning from Japanese camps and Japanese POWs returning from American camps represented a 60-pound gap between cruelty and abundance. 43 pounds lost versus 17 pounds gained. 60 pounds of proof that one side had fought to conquer, while the other had fought to preserve a civilization worth living in. When the General W.H. Gordon reached Yokohama on December 3, 1945, General Douglas MacArthur's
Occupation forces had been transforming Japan for 3 months. The POWs disembarked into a country they barely recognized. American MPs directed traffic. American medics ran food distribution centers. American engineers were rebuilding infrastructure destroyed by American bombs. The conquerors were proving to be exactly what prisoners like Yamamoto had described: powerful beyond measure, and strangely compassionate in their exercise of that power.